Good evening. My name is Paul Hiller, Technical Director of Production of the Cuban Cultural Center of New York. We're happy to present today an overview of Judaism in Cuba by Cuban-American anthropologist Ruth Behar. She is an award-winning author of 8 books, which include poetry, fiction for young readers, and the travel memoirs An Island Called Home, Returning to Jewish Cuba, and Traveling Heavy, a memoir in between journeys. Her recent novel, Letters from Cuba, is a Sidney Taylor Notable Book and won an International Latino Book Award. Her picture book, Tia Fortuna's New Home, a Cuban Sephardic story, will be released in 2022, as is the 25th anniversary edition of her classic work, The Vulnerable Observer, Anthropology That Breaks Your Heart. Ruth Behar is also the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant and a Guggenheim Fellowship, and was named a Great Immigrant by the Carnegie Corporation. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and is a Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. We will now begin with a trailer of her 2002 documentary, Adiós, Querida.
My grandparents came to Cuba in the 1920s. They arrived with thousands of other Jews on boats large and small, escaping growing anti-Semitism in Europe. Cuba welcomed them at a time when the United States was closing its doors to Jewish immigrants. But sadly, I've come to learn, our survival was an accident of racism. Jews were admitted only because the white rulers of Cuba were afraid Afro-Cubans might one day take over the island. Even Jews, like my family, not welcome in the U.S., were white enough to dilute the so-called black peril. And yet, I am grateful to have been born in Cuba. I descend from Jews who found refuge in Cuba, and only because of this didn't perish in the Holocaust. I am Jewish because I am Cuban. In Cuba, Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews remained apart. When my parents married in 1956, both families considered the union a kind of intermarriage because my mother was Ashkenazi and my father was Sephardic. My mother's family couldn't believe there were Jews who didn't speak Yiddish, but for my father's family, being Jewish meant speaking Spanish. The Cuban Revolution came in 1959. Initially, my parents were delighted. The rent in their apartment was reduced by half, and my mother was able to buy a lamp she'd admired and not been able to afford. My parents were in their mid-20s and living on the modest salary my father earned working as an accountant for my mother's uncle, Moises. But as the revolution turned socialist, properties were nationalized. My mother's uncle lost his store. My grandparents lost their lace shop. My parents felt their livelihood was threatened, and they decided to leave Cuba. By the early 1960s, the Jewish community in Cuba withered as thousands of Jewish Cubans lost their businesses and embarked on yet another immigrant journey, this time to the United States, which years before had rejected them. They wept bitter tears as they said goodbye to the beloved island that had given them refuge. The saddest photograph of my Baba, my maternal grandmother, was taken the day she left Cuba.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today. Many thanks to Iraida Iturralde and the Cuban Cultural Center of New York for inviting me to speak about Jewish Cuba. So I'm going to tell you about the community on the island, the Cuban Jewish diaspora community, and also interweave some of my own personal stories as a Cuban Jew. So let's get started. So I'm going to start by talking about Jewish immigration to Cuba. And that's an interesting topic in itself because you have the question of where do I start? At what point in history do I start talking about Jewish immigration to Cuba? If you look back at Columbus and the conquest of the Americas, Columbus landing more or less in what is Baracoa today in Cuba, we know that he was accompanied by Luis de Torres, who might possibly be the man off to the side with the long hair. And it was well known that Luis de Torres was a converso. So he had been a Jew, and he and his family had converted to Catholicism in the 15th century. And that was the moment of the Inquisition, and then of the expulsion in 1492, the expulsion of Sephardic Jews, which takes place simultaneously with the conquest of the Americas. So we know, historians know, that there were conversos in Cuba from very early on, but they were not publicly Jewish people. They maintained any kind of connection to their Judaism secret and very much hidden and under wraps. So that's what we know from the pre-20th century period. But what we do know for sure is that the Jews started coming to Cuba after the Spanish-American War, and I'm showing you this cartoon as kind of a symbol of that. Uncle Sam saying, "I'll take care of this lady now," to Spain. And so after the Spanish-American War in the early 1900s, that's when religious freedom becomes possible in Cuba, because Cuba had been a strictly Catholic nation up until the end of the Spanish-American War. And at that point, after the Americans intervened, that's when different religions become part of Cuban life or practiced in Cuba. Many Protestants find their way to Cuba and missionize, and so we have the rise of Cuban Protestantism on the island. And that's also the moment during which Jewish practice and Jewish identity becomes visible in Cuba. So the United States had had many, many Jewish immigrants at the end of the 19th century, and this anti-Semitic cartoon shows that process. So there was a huge wave of Jewish migration to the United States in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And just like today, there were very strong xenophobic attitudes towards these immigrants. And so by 1924, the US passes an Immigration and Nationality Act seeking to limit the number of people immigrating to the United States from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And they establish a quota system, and here you have some numbers to look at, and you can see that particularly immigrants from Poland and from Turkey were very much controlled by this quota system. Very, very few, very small percentages could find a way into the United States. And this included many, many Jewish people, obviously, who were from those countries at the time in the early 20th century. And so this was a moment when conditions were growing very desperate for Jewish people, particularly in Eastern Europe and particularly in Poland. They were trying to find a way out and trying to get to the United States, but couldn't. And so instead, they learned that the door was open to Cuba, that Cuba was close to the United States, and that if they could just get to Cuba, they could practically swim over to the US from Cuba. So there were all these routes from Poland and Russia and Turkey to Cuba in this period, particularly in the teens, 20s, and 30s. That was the period of most migration. But we need to remember that the first Jewish community in Cuba was actually a community formed by American Jewish expatriates. There were many who settled in Cuba after the Spanish-American War. They had businesses in Cuba. There were many opportunities in Cuba at this moment. And it was American Jews who founded the first Jewish cemetery in Cuba. It's located in Guanabacoa, so on the outskirts of Havana. And that was the first kind of space for Jewish bodies at death to be buried. And it's very, very important for Jewish people to be buried specifically in a Jewish cemetery with other Jewish people. So interestingly, that was the first institution, I guess we could say, founded in Cuba by Jewish people. Later, there was another cemetery founded in Guanabacoa by Sephardic Jews. So The American Jews, like I said, had many businesses on the island, many of them in Havana, like this very famous restaurant, this American kosher restaurant called Moishe Pipik, and which is funny to people who know Yiddish because Pipik means belly button, so is Moshe's belly button. Very well known and very famous restaurant at the time, and people of the era definitely remember this restaurant. But nevertheless, the American Jews were an important community, but a small community on the island. And it was really the immigrants who came from Europe that really expanded the Jewish community in Cuba. So I'm going to share some of my personal story as a way of sharing some of the history of Cuba. These are my grandparents, my paternal grandparents who came from Turkey. They were Sephardic Jews. My abuelo and abuela, as we called them, Isaac and Rebecca, they met in Cuba, but they were both from the same town in Turkey, very near Istanbul, Silivri. Many Sephardic Jews immigrated from Silivri to Cuba, and many of them settled in La Habana Vieja in Old Havana, as my grandparents did. And my grandparents had 4 children. The fourth wasn't born yet, my tia Fanny. But here you see the first 3, and that little boy in that white suit is my father. And so they settled in La Habana Vieja in Calle Oficios. They lived there. This is the entrance to the building where they lived, looking out on the Bay of Havana, Puerto de La Habana. And they were part of the community that attended the Shevet Ahim synagogue, this Sephardic, the first Sephardic synagogue to be built in Cuba. And curiously, it was built in La Calle Inquisidor, on the Inquisitor's Street, curiously enough. And I got to go to the synagogue and attend services there up through the early 90s. And then it closed down because, unfortunately, the roof was caving in. So that was on my father's side, the Sephardic migration. And there were many Sephardic Jews who immigrated from Turkey, some from Syria and Lebanon as well, just as there were also Christian immigrants from Syria and Lebanese who immigrated from Lebanon who immigrated in this period. But the vast majority of immigrants were from Poland, also many from Russia and Hungary and Germany and other places. But Poland was the country from which the majority of people immigrated to Cuba. And here you have my maternal grandmother and maternal grandfather, Esther and Maximo, and they meet in Havana as well. And my grandmother, Esther, has a very interesting story because she was the first of 7 children to immigrate to Cuba to meet up with her father, who was there struggling to make enough money to bring the rest of the family over from Poland. He wasn't doing very well. He finally saved enough money to bring one of his children, and he wanted to bring one of his sons. But my grandmother was the eldest, and she begged him to let her be the first and promised that even though she was a girl, a young woman, she would help him bring everybody, and she did. So very heroic story. And she was from this town of Govorovo, a couple of hours away from Warsaw. And she eventually united the family and brought everybody to Cuba, almost everybody, the close family, her siblings and her mother. And they settled in the countryside in Agramonte in the province of Matanzas, which I always found very curious. And the man that you see there in the straw hat, that was my great-grandfather, Abraham Abram. And so they lived in Agramonte, and I found that so fascinating always. I'm also, aside from being a writer, I'm also a cultural anthropologist. And so I eventually found my way to Agramonte and did some research there on this town. And all of that is part of my novel, Letters from Cuba, which is based on my grandmother's story. And it's about a young girl named Esther from Poland, goes to Cuba to help bring her family over, to help save her family on the eve of World War II. And the story is set in Agramonte, inspired by that presence of my family there. And the book is also available in Spanish as Cartas de Cuba. So let me tell you a little bit more now about the general Jewish community of Cuba. So what's so amazing about this community is that in a short amount of time, they did so much, arriving between the teens and then the late 50s. In those 30, 40 years, they accomplished so much and built so many Jewish institutions in Cuba. It also says something about Cuba, that there was a great deal of tolerance towards Jewish people. And they established synagogues, as you can see here. Early on, the Beth Israel Synagogue was the American synagogue. But then you see that by the 20s and 30s, they established many Jewish communities and synagogues, not only in La Habana, but in Santiago de Cuba and in the central part of Cuba as well, and even have a synagogue in a small town like Banes, which is really fascinating. Here to show you on a map, might be easier to see that, La Habana had 5 synagogues at its height by the 50s, with services in Hebrew, English, Yiddish, and Ladino. But there were also synagogues and communities scattered all over the island. Camajuani has a Jewish cemetery. There was a synagogue in Santa Clara and Camagüey, in Guantánamo and Santiago de Cuba. So quite amazing how the Jewish community spread out through the island, though the major institutions were in Havana, the major synagogues and schools were in Havana, but there were Jewish communities all over the island, Ashkenazi and Sephardic, Eastern European, and also from Turkey. And so, as I said, they established schools. They had many Jewish schools of different kinds, more secular ones and more religious ones. There was a Jewish day school in Havana where instruction was in Spanish and Yiddish. So they were very, very active in maintaining their Jewish identity, while at the same time immersing themselves in Cuban life and becoming very, very Cuban. Here's another map to show you all of the many institutions and negocios, the Jewish businesses that particularly existed in Old Havana in the pre-59 period, and also many businesses as well held by Jewish people in Santiago de Cuba, on the eastern end of Cuba, where there were many more Sephardic Jews than Ashkenazi Jews. So what's so poignant for me about this community is that by the 1950s, they've really kind of solidified their presence in Cuba. The number of Jews by then is about 15,000, more or less, so it's a fairly large community. And they decide to build a Jewish community center in La Habana, en El Vedado. La Casa de la Comunidad Hebrea de Cuba, as it was called. It later becomes known as the Patronato, and it's a huge undertaking. As you can see, it occupies a manzana completamente, like one whole block, well, more than a block, 2 blocks. And what's so fascinating about it, too, is that it was designed, you can see it here, it was designed by Capablanca, one of Cuba's foremost architects at the time. And it was meant to be a Jewish community center that would bring the community together. They have a library, they have a banquet hall. So they've really created this very, very important space for the Jewish community that still exists to this day. And we'll talk more about it in a moment. And it has this arch at the top, leading up to the sky, this sensation of we're going to be here for a long time. And right around the same time, a couple of years afterwards, the Sephardic Jews also build a new, better synagogue, the Centro Hebreo Sefaradi de Cuba, which also still exists, also in Vedado, in Havana, to this day. And so, as I said, the Jewish community maintains its Jewishness, but also inserts itself into Cuban life. And you can see it in this wonderful ad for the famous Tropicana nightclub. It's in Spanish and Yiddish, and they have this event commemorating José Martí, also as seen by the Hebrews, right? Martí visto por Hebreos, and it's held in Spanish and Yiddish, which is so interesting. So coming back to the personal, here are my parents, who meet very young in Havana. It was very unusual at the time for an Ashkenazi Jew to marry a Sephardic Jew, my mother being Ashkenazi of Eastern European heritage, my father Sephardic of Turkish heritage. Though they're both Jewish, they had very, very different customs, traditions, cuisines, etc., and even different Jewish languages, because the Ashkenazi Jews speak Yiddish and Sephardic Jews speak Ladino, and Ashkenazi Jews at that time assumed that to be a Jew, you had to speak Yiddish. That was the Jewish language, and they couldn't understand how there were Jews who didn't speak Yiddish but spoke an old form of Spanish called Ladino, as was the case with my father's family. So nevertheless, despite some conflict, they married in 1956, and the two families came together. And I've written about the family in this book, Traveling Heavy, a memoir in between journeys. It's also in Spanish, where I retitled it Un cierto aire Sephardi. And there's a story that I tell there about the conflict between the two families, not when I was born, but when my brother was born in 1959. And there was a conflict about what he should be named. And my mother decided to name my brother after one of her father's brothers who had died in the Holocaust, to remember him, Mordechai. And that seemed totally logical to her. But then my father's parents came to the hospital after the baby was born and said, no, you should name him Isaac after me. And that was my father's father. And my mother couldn't understand how you could name a baby after a living grandfather, because the Ashkenazi custom is that you only name children after dead relatives, dead ancestors, not living people. And so they had a huge conflict about it, and it was very, very severe and serious, so I heard. I was too young then to really understand what was going on. But finally, my mother and father decided to name my brother Morris Isaac, to also incorporate my grandfather, but we never called him Isaac or Isaac. So in many ways, they gave him the name, but we never called him by that name. So that was one of several conflicts that took place between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic side of the family in Cuba. So here I am with my mother, growing up in La Habana, a little girl, but living very close to the Malecon, and also very close, half a block away from the synagogue that I talked about, the Jewish Community Center, the Patronato. And so I was frequently photographed in front of the synagogue, as you see here. So I might have had a childhood in Cuba, but that was interrupted, as it was for so many others, by the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro coming to power in 1959. And the Jewish community at first was supportive of the revolution, as so many Cubans were. They didn't all depart right away in 59. Many were still in Cuba in 1960 and even in early 61. And here you can see that Rabbi Gambach, who was a very close family friend, he published in 1960 in La Habana a Haggadah de Pesach, which is used in the holiday of Passover in the Seder. So I always thought that was so interesting that this publication came out after the revolution. So people were still there at that time. The Jewish community was still there. But then that changes by 61 with the Bay of Pigs invasion, and then the move to nationalize properties, to make all of the schools public schools, and eventually closing down all of the private parochial schools, which included Catholic schools, but also Jewish schools. All of that was very threatening to the majority of the Jewish community, and there was a mass exodus of Jews who left between 61 and 62 especially. Many left. From that 15,000, about 2,000 were left. So about 80 to 90% of the community takes off and leaves Cuba at that time. This gives you a little sense of that as well, and you can see how the numbers really declined very, very dramatically. And you also see that there were more Ashkenazi Jews than Sephardic Jews as well in Cuba, those proportions. So the majority go to New York and Miami. My family went to New York. I grew up in New York. I came when I was 5 years old. We settled in Queens, very near the World's Fair, and I remember being really impressed by that as a girl. We went to see that, and just New York as kind of this port, to the whole world. And getting used to snow, right? Getting used to a very, very different life in New York from what we were used to in a tropical island like Cuba. And something very strange happened soon after we arrived from Cuba. We were in a terrible car accident, and I ended up having to be in bed for close to a year recovering. And I ended up writing a young adult novel called Lucky Broken Girl about that story. So it's a story that merges the Cuban immigrant story with also a story of a girl who suddenly is immobilized and using her imagination to get through this very, very difficult period. Here's an illustration to just show you that what that was like. So in Lucky Broken Girl, I have a lot of allusions to particularly the mother. Mommy has a lot of memories of Cuba. And when her sister says, hermanita, you make the best flan, Mommy says, not as good as the flan I used to make in Cuba. The sugar isn't the same here and the milk is so watery. So all of that nostalgia for Cuba is also very present in the story. But the majority of the Cuban Jews went to Miami, as did the majority of the Cuban community as a whole. And very interestingly, the Ashkenazi community and the Sephardic community, each of them creates and founds their own synagogue in Miami. So there's the Cuban Hebrew community, which is founded by Ashkenazi, Eastern European Jews, very close to Lincoln Road. And very interestingly, they remember the patronato, they remember the synagogue, the Jewish community center that they built in the mid-50s. And then several years later, they had to abandon this incredible project that they had created, expecting that they would be in Cuba for many, many generations. And so they remember it. This is a plaque inside the synagogue, inside the Cuban Hebrew congregation. And so they held on to a lot of their customs and traditions. This was a shoe store many years ago run by a Cuban Jewish immigrant. And I love the sign, Se habla Yiddish. And then Bernardo Benes, who many of you will have heard of, who was very active in trying to establish relations with Cuba in the late 70s. He was editing this newsletter, this boletin, Juban, right? And so coming up with this new identity of being Jewish and Cuban now in Miami, now in the United States. And so that's on the Eastern European side, Ashkenazi side. On the Sephardic side, they built another temple, Temple Moses, further up in North Miami Beach. And here's the facade of Temple Moses. And they have a plaque, a very interesting plaque where they say, we will never forget what we left behind on the island of Cuba. So again, this strong connection to Cuba, which gave all of these Jewish people refuge at a time when they really needed refuge, right? On the eve of the war, on the eve of the Holocaust. And up until now, unfortunately, up until the pandemic, the women at Temple Moses, every Tuesday, they would make borrecas and other dishes, other Sephardic dishes, particularly borrecas and bulemas, that they would sell to members of the community to help support the temple. And the majority of Cuban Jews have not really gone back to Cuba to visit the island, but a few have. And the Habib family, as you see here, many years ago, went to the Tropicana nightclub, photographed themselves there. And actually, very sadly, Mr. Habib, Moreno Habib, died a couple of years after that. So he was able to go back and show his family where he and his wife were from. The Sephardic men often get together to play dominoes, just as if they were in Cuba, as you see here. And this is part of research that I've been doing on the Cuban Jewish community in Miami. And there's also a portion of a Jewish cemetery in Miami where many of the Cuban Jews are buried. And I was so struck when I found this grave, Ruth Behar, not related to me, who was Abuelo Papi, el rey del dominó en nuestro corazón siempre. And then you can see the tombstone there lined with domino pieces to remember him. That was just incredible. There you have this fusion of the Jewish and the Cuban. That's so incredible. So I started traveling to Cuba in the early 90s. I'm an anthropologist, as I said, and I was really curious to see this place I'd heard so much about and to do research there. And initially I went back to the places where I had been as a child, places where I had been photographed, to kind of reclaim those places in a certain way. It was, of course, a very difficult time to be in Cuba in the early 90s. It was the time of the Balsero crisis. And there I was, along with other Cuban Americans that were heading back in this moment. There I was going back, and there were so many people trying to leave Cuba at this time. So that was very, very wrenching wrenching to be there and to witness that, I wanting to return and find my roots, and people trying desperately to get out of the island. So it was a time that I was just kind of, taking in all of this information. It was very emotional. I was thinking about all the broken streets in Havana, thinking about the broken gravestones in the Jewish cemetery in Guanabacoa that I mentioned to you before, and this broken star that I found in the cemetery as well. And all of that led to a poem, Broken Streets of My City, in English and Spanish, and a very amazing friendship with Rolando Esteves, who makes artist books in Cuba, and he created a beautiful handmade book of my poem. It's a very long poem, and the poem is kind of all folded up into this beautiful case, and then it comes out, and it's like a long street, like a calle, like a long street. And here you can kind of get a sense of what it looks like. I actually fell on one of these streets in Havana and became very afraid of walking on them. It incorporates a picture of me and my parents that he colored in very beautifully. And here's just a couple of lines from the poem. I come back, an old child. Now they call me Señora. I still come back after so many years. An old little girl, una niña vieja. Mami, papi, please come back. Walk these broken streets of our Havana together with me. Listen to me, your niña vieja. Let me lead you through these broken streets, because my parents have never wanted to go back to Cuba. And so I made a documentary called Adiós Querida that focuses on the Sephardic community, Sephardic Jewish community of Cuba. It was dedicated to my father, who definitely does not want to go back to Cuba, and I wanted to show him the Sephardic presence on the island. We did some filming as well in New York and New Jersey, and there's a Jewish cemetery in New Jersey that's actually called Shevet Ahim, remembering the synagogue in Havana, and that's where my grandparents, my paternal grandparents that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, are buried, and I was there bringing stones to the graves, which is a Jewish tradition. And in Cuba, just looking around to understand what was left of that important Jewish presence that was founded before 59, finding these Torahs, 9 Torahs that were brought from Turkey, and getting to know a very special little girl who now is a young woman. I spent a lot of time interviewing her and her family. She has a very interesting mix. Her mother is Afro-Cuban. Her father is Jewish Cuban of Sephardic origin, and she grew up with these two cultures, but her mother allowed her father to bring her up as Jewish, and so she was brought up Jewish by her father. Her father at the time in Cuba ran the Sephardic synagogue that I mentioned in Havana, the Centro Hebreo Sefaradi, and she spent all of her youth and childhood spending a lot of time at the synagogue. Here she is with her mother. Her mother's a Jehovah's Witness, which is also very interesting. So Danaida, that's her name, was very aware of these different different religious traditions, and her father prepared her for her bat mitzvah, taught her to chant from the Torah, which was very, very beautiful, but also very unusual. And as the years passed, Danaida decided that she really wanted to immigrate to Israel to make Aliyah, as we say, that was where she belonged. She belonged there and not in Cuba. It was a very long process. Jews in Cuba are allowed to leave for Israel, but then that has to all be approved by the Israeli government. And if it is, then they get their trip paid for, they get a stipend for their first year in Israel, and other kinds of support. And so Danaida made that decision. It was very, very difficult to leave her mom behind. She was very, very close to her mother, but she decided she really wanted to start a new life in Israel, and her father ended up going with her. Then subsequently she met her husband, who's from the Dominican Republic, and they married, and she brought him to Israel, and they currently live in Israel. She now has 2 little girls, as you see here, and she's just really become a Cuban Israeli at this point, very, very fluent in Israel, very fluent in Israeli life and in Hebrew. And so that's so interesting that this Cuban Jewish person has now started a completely new life in Israel. And I continue to think about Sephardic topics. I have a new book coming out in January that's a picture book for kids. It's a Jewish Cuban story, but it's also a Sephardic Jewish Cuban story, and where I take up Sephardic themes again. But I also investigated the Jewish community in general in Cuba, and I wrote this book, An Island Called Home, and did research with the help of a photographer in Cuba, Humberto Mayol, who helped me to document the Jewish community in Cuba. This was about 13 years ago. And the book also came out in Spanish, Una Isla Llamada Hogar. So this research took me all over the island of Cuba, meeting as many of the Jews as I could find on the island. Spent, of course, a lot of time in Havana, back in this temple that I mentioned at the beginning, the Patronato Synagogue, which is a real hub of Jewish life in Cuba to this day, but with a much smaller community, a community of about 1,000 or possibly even lower than that at this point, maybe 800 or 900 or so people. And what was very interesting to me is a place that had so many personal connections for me, so many emotional connections, that this became a kind of pilgrimage site for many, many people that were traveling to Cuba in the 90s and in the 2000s, very, very curious to learn about the Jewish community of the island. And here we see Adela Dworin, who is the president of the Jewish community, showing some visitors around the synagogue. She is an incredible person. She really is, in many ways, the heart and soul of the community. She took care of the library. I mentioned that the Patronato from the beginning had a library, and she made it her mission to take care of these books during the whole era of the heyday of the revolution in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And to this day, it's the most important Jewish library in Cuba. She's a lawyer by training. She speaks fluent English and Yiddish and Spanish, of course. And what's so amazing about her is she remembers and was part of the pre-revolutionary community, and then has been so important in maintaining the post-revolutionary community. And note this wonderful bookcase in the form of a Jewish star, and right below Jose Marti. So constantly these efforts to merge the Cuban and the Jewish cultures. And so the community throughout the years received many, many donations of medications, and they created a pharmacy at the Patronato Synagogue for members of the community and for outsiders who have prescriptions for medications that they can't find. And then they were receiving at one point so many medications that they were sharing those with hospitals around the island. This is Ruth Behar, who's a doctor, and she was very instrumental in sharing a lot of these medications with people who needed them in Cuba. So as I said, there was this great interest in the Jewish community of Cuba. Many, many American Jews began to travel to Cuba, particularly in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it was very interesting to me to see that one of the places that was visited was this cemetery that I mentioned at the very beginning, this first Jewish cemetery established in Cuba. And I should say that I was part of this as well myself, because I also have led Jewish trips to Cuba in the past. So I wanted to find a deeper way of telling the story of the Jews of Cuba today. Who are the people who live in Cuba today? As an anthropologist, I'm really interested in people's life stories and narratives. And so I really went around seeking these stories, and this is a particularly moving one. This is Julito Eli, who lives in Caibarien, and he's holding up the picture of his sister who died of leukemia at the age of 25 in 1977. And he told me the whole story of just how horrible this was for his family, for his father, who was still alive at the time, to lose, this daughter who was studying at the University of Havana. She was a scientist, very, very smart young woman, and died so sadly of leukemia. And they had the problem of where do we bury her? There is a Jewish cemetery in Santa Clara, but it wasn't being very well taken care of in the late 70s, in that moment of revolutionary fervor. And they were very concerned that the tomb be well taken care of. And so they decided to bury her in the Catholic cemetery in Caibarien, which was so moving, and to create a niche, a special space, like a Jewish space within this big Catholic cemetery. And so that was one of the ways during this period of the 70s and 80s, before the revitalization of the Jewish community, which takes place in the 90s, was one of the ways in which Jewish people sought to maintain their culture. Other things that were so interesting, this was Isaac. And so the Jewish community has been receiving over the years, starting in the 90s in particular, once the Cuban government opened up to religion in the early 90s and made it possible for people to be a member of the Communist Party and to have a religious affiliation. That was the moment of revitalization, of religious revitalization. And the Jews were part of that revitalization. That was when many people came back and reclaimed a Jewish identity, when young people learned about this Jewish identity that had been basically kept quiet for the main decades, the three main decades of the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so many donations started coming to Cuba, among them the matzahs, the round matzahs that are prepared by Orthodox Jews. And this was just so charming that Isaac took the matzah box, and attached a stick to it, and that became a handheld fan. And I was so enamored of it that then at the end of the interview and the photographs, he gave it to me, and I still have it. And so I found that people had, even during those years of the revolution, when atheism was being enforced on people, imposed on people, that people held on to all of these memories of their Jewish identity, among them a kippah from a wedding in 1959, a talit that had been brought from Turkey by a grandfather, the wine cups, the Shabbat candle holders. Many Jews, when leaving Cuba, couldn't take everything with them. Of course, they had to leave most of their possessions behind. And so this one person that I interviewed had inherited all of these wine cups and candle holders. Finding that there's a mezuzah hanging up at a door, remembering that Jewish family that once lived there. There's also the ketubah, the Jewish marriage contract that belonged to a Turkish abuela back in the 1920s. It's in the possession of Sarah, who you see here, and she described it very sadly as una carta de libertad, telling me about how various people in the family, including her son and daughter, had used this ketubah to prove that they are Jewish, and thereby to be able to immigrate to Israel. And then other family members used it as well, some to stay in Israel and others to then go on to other places like Mexico City and Miami. And as she said, how do you prove you're a Jew? You need to have documents. And I found that so incredibly interesting. And she has photographs from the Las Quinceañera that was held in the Patronato Synagogue in 1959. And then she said to me, of all those women, I'm the only one who has stayed in Cuba. So the sense of being left behind, of being shipwrecked on the island. I went to Palma Soriano, and there I was very fortunate to meet Jaime Gans Green, who was an amazing person. He was the last Jewish person living in Palma Soriano at that time. He had kept a lot of letters in Yiddish and photographs from relatives who perished in the Holocaust. And it was just so fascinating to meet him. And I'm so glad I did, because several years later, he passed away. And he also showed me this terrifying postcard from a concentration camp with, as you can see, with the Hitler stamps on it. And so then back to Havana, the Cuban government was so aware of all of this interest in the Jewish community that they built a hotel, a Jewish-themed hotel in Havana. I should say they didn't build it. The building was already there. They restored this beautiful Art Nouveau building and called it the Hotel Raquel. And it's a Jewish-themed hotel, very, very close to La Plaza Vieja. And each of the rooms is named after a biblical figure, an Old Testament figure. And there's even a room called Ruth, which led me to speculate about this hotel with 25 rooms, each of them named after a biblical character. There's even a room named Ruth, and maybe that's what exists for people like me who are always looking back, a room that bears my name at the Jewish theme hotel in Havana. So the community continues to evolve, and I've been doing ongoing research in Cuba. I was last there in very early March 2020, right before the pandemic. And so just to tell you about a couple of other things now going on in the community today, David Thatcher, who's the leader of the Jewish community in Santa Clara, a very, very small community, maybe of a dozen people. And as you know, Santa Clara is where the mausoleum is located with Che Guevara's remains. And it has a Jewish cemetery that was very abandoned for a long time, and he made it a point to fix and restore the cemetery and to build a very important monument in memory of the 6 million who perished in the Holocaust. So there was nothing like this in the cemetery, and he thought it was very important that this presence be there. And many school children from Santa Clara are brought to see this memorial to those who died in the Holocaust. Here he is with some other members of the community, and his grandfather was the last person to use the synagogue in Santa Clara. And since he was only one person, he was the one that turned in the key to the government, and it became a cultural center. And that was something that really bothered David Tachet, and eventually he did fundraising and built a new synagogue in Santa Clara, and that's where they're standing at this new synagogue that he built. And you can see here again sort of the meshing of different symbols, the island of Cuba with the menorah and the Jewish star. There's a community in Guantanamo as well. It's led by Rodolfo in the red t-shirt at the edge of the frame here. It's a small community, but a very lively community as well. In Guantanamo, still exists today. But the largest community is in La Habana, and up until the pandemic moment, they would have very, very large events for some of the Jewish holidays, particularly Hanukkah, and would invite leaders of other religious communities to come to the Hanukkah party, the Hanukkah festival. And quite striking, they had this enormous Cuban flag there for this one Hanukkah festival that I got to go to, and the Israeli flag is there as well. And they had performances and speeches and dances. The community has a Rikudim club, a dance club where they dance Israeli and other Jewish dances. And up to now, they were being taught by this young man that you see at the front in the blue t-shirt. He's a dancer with the Tropicana nightclub and a ballet dancer, and he would come and teach the kids how to dance and choreograph these really, really lavish, incredible dance numbers. So the community continues to receive support from the American Jewish community, Canadian Jewish community, Latin American communities, Argentine and Panamanian and Mexican especially, and they receive things like gefilte fish, a very common dish among Ashkenazi Jews. And the community now is very, very connected to the world Jewish community and very, very aware of the story of the Holocaust, of course. They have a whole exhibit on the Holocaust at the Sephardic, at the Centro Sephardi that I mentioned in Havana. And here a group of people, very active people in the community, many of them teachers, because they have a Sunday school that meets in the various synagogues for all the different age groups, from children to adults, and they're holding up these signs with the "We Remember" hashtag for Holocaust Remembrance Day. And so when I was there in early March 2020, I got to spend some time with the young people in the community. So as I said, Sunday school is something that they're allowed to do in Cuba, and they spend a lot of time learning about Jewish history, Hebrew. They watch films. They're very, very up to date on what's going on in the Jewish community around the world. And here you see a group of little girls, all of them dressed as Queen Esther for Purim. Purim is a holiday where kids dress up, and many of them frequently dress up as the girls, dress up as Queen Esther. And this picture shows you the great diversity of the community today, very different from what existed in the late 50s when my parents got married, and when it was just crazy, unusual for an Ashkenazi and a Sephardic Jew to marry because they had different Jewish traditions. Now you can see that the community is much more diverse and inclusive of a variety of people of very, very different backgrounds. And I should say the conversion is also an important part of the community, that many of the Jewish people in the community are Jewish on one side of their family and possibly not on another side of their family, but they convert to Judaism to become more religiously in line with Judaism. So that also is a very, very common pattern in the community. And without the conversions, there probably would be very few Jewish people. I think I only counted about a dozen people who are Jewish, both on the mother's and father's side in Cuba. So that is an important element of the community today. So let me just end with a poem from my book, Todo lo que guardé, to hopefully bring all of this together, called Prayer. This happens to me often, too often. I am on my way home, driving down familiar streets, only a few blocks to go, and out of nowhere, a merciless hand comes and grips my heart and wrings it dry. I tremble. Fog clouds my eyes. I am no longer sure if I'm awake or dreaming. If I die, who will find me? All I can do is pray. Let me return home. I am almost there. Please. I don't know why this happens. What I know is that so far my prayers have been answered. Hardly breathing, I reach my house, and when I open the door, I hear many keys clanging. The keys my ancestors stubbornly took with them to their exile. Now I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you so much.